Well, it's that time. You've been asking away all day and our speakers are ready to answer. Thank you so much, speakers, for joining us again. Our team's been hard at work curating your questions, and I've got them right here on the old iPad. But first, we've got the results of today's live polls. And here's what we learned. A vast majority of you, more than 60%, take action as part of civil society. And you're evenly split on where change needs to happen for maximum impact. Half of you think it's on the global level, and the other half say it's local, which I think means we need action everywhere. And I'm still waiting for the results of that last question about how likely you are to alter your actions based on what you heard today, but I hope you all felt moved. I know I certainly did. And with that, let's get to your questions. And speakers, I'll just ask you to keep your answers relatively tight so we can get to everyone who's able to join us today. So with that, first, I have a question for Hala Thomas-Daughter, CEO and Chief Change Catalyst of the B Team, who comes from the panel on inclusive economic systems. The question comes from Micah Nakaoka in New York, who says, thank you for pointing out such a great point. Even high-profile business leaders and activists seem to go blind on the core and focus too much on one small goal. What kind of practice or education do you think would help everyone to realize the importance of inner voice and core compass? Hala, take it away.
Oh, thank you, Nadira. Thanks for having me. And thank you, Micah, for a great question. Well, I think we need to start by breaking down the silos in education. And I think sustainability and inclusion need to be part of how we think about anything you study. And we also need to bridge the head and the heart and the hands. I think our education is primarily focused on our left brain right now, not in the connectivity between the right and the left, and the connectivity between our heart and our head and our hands. And when we align that, meditation might be a good mandatory course for everyone to learn. And I think in general, time is time for very deep, specialized technical expertise is kind of past time, because technology will probably solve a lot of that. But connecting the whole and connecting the heart to the soul, if you will, is going to be what unlocks transformational leadership in people at a moment like this. And we need transformational leadership and reset for business education for sure.
That's the human part, which I think is so important. And it actually leads me to a question for Jay Naidu, who's a board member of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, and a storied activist, as many of you know, who came from the In Conversation session on combating racism and discrimination. This question comes from someone in our audience who asks, what do you think is bringing out extreme racism? Speaking to that question of humanity and connectivity. Jay, take it away. Oh, you're on mute. It's the beauty of live.
Thank you. I'm so admiring your smile. You know, you bring such positive energy to the conversation, you know.
Well, right back at you.
No, I think this never was the case. You know, the human beings have been around for 200,000 years, you know, but real racism has really emerged in the last 500 years. Because prior to that, you know, Africa was the place in which great civilizations existed, where language, music, agriculture, a lot of the technology that we use today, this was the birth of it in the continent that is the cradle of all humanity. So when did we start to have this? And this is in the mid of the so-called Renaissance in Europe, where, you know, the exploration of the new world, as they called it, meant that, you know, they had to justify what they had to do to exploit both people, environment, assets, and resources. And so at the core of slavery, of colonization, of a very brutal form of economic exploitation that even exists today, you had to justify it. And the way to justify it, what they did, which was violent and brutal, they had to justify in terms that someone was more superior to others. And so these are the roots, and it's a wound. And unless we go to the wound, we'll find that we cover it up and we sweep it under the carpet, and it constantly comes back. And we repeat the emotional and psychological trauma. So actually, we're deeply wounded as a humanity, not just what we do to each other based on race, on class, and sexual orientation, but also what we do to Mother Earth. And I think there's a fundamental challenge with how we see human evolution and this notion that we have dominion, when we actually are not more important than any other species, including the coronavirus. Everything has a right to life. And so perhaps we should ask ourselves, is there a message in this pandemic about us awakening to our true potential to rise and transcend the limitations of our mind, of our intellect, and this body, and the notion, the false notion that we are more important than anything else on this planet. And I think that
because it's all connected. Yep, that desire for superiority is so part and parcel of it. And it speaks to that mindfulness point that Hala made just a moment ago. So I want to go from one storied labor activist to another. We have with us Rula Sighire, Strategic Program Coordinator of the International Domestic Workers Federation, who was also on the Inclusive Economic Systems panel. And Rula, we have a question for you from Matthews Malenga in Zambia, who says, speaking of domestic workers' inclusion in policymaking, how can political intervention be included and influenced on behalf of domestic workers and raising their wages?
Thank you for this question. The ideal scenario is that domestic workers will have representation within unions. What we know is that a lot of countries ban syndicalism for domestic workers because first, they do not recognize it as a profession, therefore they do not allow them to exist within labor unions. And second, for populations that are largely migrant populations, this is also the case because syndicalism or unionism is exclusive to people who hold the citizenship. So I would say the first step towards making that possible, to giving a seat on the table on every conversation that involves government, civil society, employers, and every stakeholder, is to create an environment that fosters freedom of expression and that fosters freedom of congregation and freedom of forming unions as well for these.
It drives me up a wall when we talk about these nebulous concepts and they don't feel concrete, but what you just said, Rula, just made freedom feel so concrete, and it gave all of us a to-do list in a way, and in a lot of ways the global goals are, of course, the world's to-do list. So that's a wonderful answer to a wonderful question. I want to go now to Olivier de Schutter, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, who is also on the Inclusive Economic Systems panel. If you didn't catch that, clearly you need to go watch it after this session because it was wonderful and had some amazing speakers. So this question comes from Dr. Usha Rupnarayan in South Africa, who asks, poverty and COVID have caused another level of inequality. How does one mitigate the impact if governments have limited resources? Olivier?
Well, thank you for this question from Usha from South Africa. I think it's an important one because until now we've been very much focused on one single answer to the question of poverty, and that is to grow the economic pie by stimulating economic growth, and then by taxes and transfers, compensating the losers from the economy by social protection and by public services. So we basically relied on infinite growth of the economy in order to address the damage caused by an unsustainable economic system that excludes much more than it includes. And in my work as Special Rapporteur, I try to indicate that however important it is to maintain and indeed to strengthen social protection systems, we must be more imaginative and also think about changing the way the economics function and business models are designed in order to ensure that the economy does not exclude, but instead includes, recognizing the contribution that each member of the community can make and trying to value the diversity of the workforce, not seeing it as a problem, as a difficulty to be overcome, but instead trying to build an as diverse workforce as possible in order to have an inclusive economy. And I think that is one way by which we can mitigate the tension between continuing to damage the environment by insisting on growth and the expansion of monetary wealth on the one hand, and on the other hand, eradicating poverty. These two objectives are both imperative, and we need to find ways to combine them with one another.
And we have to recognize it is imperative to balance them, because in a lot of ways we've been accepting unreasonable outcomes as reasonable for too long. And I love that about the way that you talk about these issues. With that, I want to go to Valentina Munoz Rabanal, who's rewriting Chile's artificial intelligence policy and is the youngest SDG advocate. You probably saw her lightning talk on digital rights. And I have a question for you, Valentina, that a lot of our participants had, but the one I'll read is from Tapashi Burua in India, who asks, how can young people effectively participate in implementation of the SDGs and fighting injustices? So here again, we're hearing that concrete action question. Valentina?
Well, that's a really big question. I think that we need to understand that the SDGs must be a part of the way we're doing politics, and we do politics not only on the places where we can vote. That's something that we talk about with Mrs. Michelle the past Monday. And I think that we need to start from them to understand what are the SDG goals and how we can make it a part of our lives, of our way of living. We can be students and work with the SDGs. We can be teachers and work with the SDGs. We need to make an intersectional work with what we do and what we want our work to be a part of the world we dream. And I think that's the starting point. But also I continue saying that we need new forms of building politicals where we can make children a part of it, a part actively and protagonist, not only for the photo, not only for the publicity. We need them to be a part of the decision table.
It's like Eddie Ndoku said, leadership is too important to be left to leaders. We all need to be in this in an active way. And because this question came from so many of our participants, I would be a fool not to ask all our other speakers to weigh in on it. What do you all, the rest of you, if anybody feels passionately about this, feel that young people in particular can do to help with the implementation of the SDGs and take ownership of that people's agenda, that global agenda that the SDGs capture so beautifully? Does anybody want to weigh in? Well, Olivier, I see you. We'll go to Olivier first, then Jay, and then loop in anyone else.
Very gracious of you, Jay. I look forward to listening to what your response will be. I think it's really interesting that in the polls that you collected, 60% said that they were willing, keen to take action. And I think the reality today is that power should not simply be for the people. It should not simply be with the people. It should be through the people by building on the social innovations that people constantly invent when confronted to new challenges. And I think that is how power can be best spread across society. It is usually conceived of power as solid, something that is in a limited number of hands. It should become liquid and spread across all of society by creating spaces allowing people to experiment and to design new solutions, new social innovations. And I think that is how democracy in the future should be conceived of. It's not simply a matter of voting for leaders, for them to decide and choose for us. It is a matter of taking our stake in our own hands, coming up with our own solutions that then policymakers can encourage, scale up, and support.
I love that. People probably laugh at me because in my scripts, I'm often saying we all the time instead of I. And for me, it's not a royal we, it's the people's we, it's us, right? And cognitively, we need to make that leap so that we feel that ownership. Jay, let's go to you. What made you excited to answer that question?
Well, my advice to young people, and I spend most of my time with young people because I have very little in common with my generation, actually.
That's a whole separate panel that we ought to do.
So I say, question everyone, question everything. If you really want to know about my mistakes that I made in my life, then you're going to have 2 weeks and we sit 12 hours a day. We all make mistakes, but we all have the best intention of delivering something that is worthy to the next generation. So, we're in a different environment now. If you look at development, we're working on a chassis that's 75 years old. It comes out of the Second World War. Actually, it's now an antique. It should be in a museum. We take it out once a year. But we are, in terms of what Einstein described as insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. Actually, let's question everything we've done. It's not working. The global economy is not working. Politics is not working. Democracy is not working. Trade unions, collective bargaining has fundamentally changed because the production process has changed. When I went into a factory when I was in the late 70s, there were 1,000 workers, there was one employer. Now everything is outsourced, everything is distributed. So things have changed, but we're hitting the nail with the same hammer, And I think today we are actually at the most exciting moment in this terribly small journey of 200,000 years on a planet that's 4.5 billion years. We're still toddlers throwing toys out of the cot. And I think we're the last you are the last generation that has the capacity and the understanding and the technology to change things fundamentally and radically. Or it's game over, not for Mother Earth. It's game over for us as a species. And unfortunately, we take every other species with us. So at the moment, really, we have to discuss what do we do to change the human pathogen? What do we have to do? What is the vaccine for the human pathogen? Because we are become an extremely destructive species. So that's the question you should be answering as a generation. I think it's the most exciting roller coaster you will go on.
And we better get on it. But Jay, I love that you
years younger to be an organizer.
You jump right in. We're ready for you. But obviously you speak in images, but I have to say that idea of a 75-year-old chassis will stay with me forever because it really makes me think we need to get some new technology going in this conversation. Before I go to the next question from participants, Hala, Valentina, and Rula, anybody want to weigh in quickly on what young people can do? And then we'll go on to more participant questions.
I'd love to, Nadira.
And I have a bit of breaking news for you too after that, but stay with us for that.
Well, I would love to, if I may, Nadira. And
yes,
Jay,
please.
Thank you for saying it. I couldn't agree more wholeheartedly. We need a reset in every single system we have. We need a rethink, redesign, and a reset. And I think we know this. And perhaps the gift in otherwise a very difficult time we've gone through as humanity is that there has been a great awakening. I feel it. We are more in touch with our heart ourselves. So I want to have two messages to existing power, because we can't reset our systems without talking to both existing and emerging leaders. And I believe there's a leader inside of every single one of us. So to existing power, if you're not thinking about changing who to change how you're leading your business, your organization, your government right now, you're not going to be relevant. You're not going to innovate. You need to be closing the gender, racial, and generational gaps around your tables to change the table, because we need to change the table. So change who to change how to existing power. To emerging leaders, there is absolute power in your very own head, hearts, and hands. This is the time to lean in. And the best leaders I see out there in existing powers, they have been unlocked because you're asking the hard questions. You're asking, are you going to be responsible for the largest intergenerational crime in history? You're asking, who will you choose to be at a time like no other for humanity? But we cannot do it by othering each other. We need a vaccine against othering or for togethering, because the only way we can get from the reality of today to where we need to be by 2030, halving emissions, closing a just and inclusive transition in less than a decade, is if we come together and stop pointing fingers at each other and start facing the mirror, asking each and every single one of us, how am I going to unlock my leadership in service of delivering the future we need? That's the question.
Absolutely. So not just people power, but young people power and personal power, personal responsibility, in addition to the shared responsibility. Rula and Valentina, any quick points on what young people can do? Also, you are young people who are doing it right now.
Very
ahead,
quick
Rula.
comment on what my colleagues have already said is that we do need a lot of humility in terms of people who are contributing to a change that is being made in today's world. And that means a lot of dialogue. I don't necessarily like the formulation of intergenerational because that assumes ruptures and things that cannot necessarily be reconciled, but I think they can be reconciled. And this is precisely because when we were younger, and some of us are still younger, and our parents used to look at us and say, you are still an idealist, and this is why you're demanding what you're demanding. This is why you're demanding a revolution, as opposed to like small tweaks into a system that is collapsing. We need to hold on to that idealism, but at the same time, we need to hold on to the experience and not imagine ourselves as people who are reinventing the wheels, because as I have said earlier, a lot of the solutions are out there. What we need to do is sit and listen to people who are leading on the grassroots level. This requires us to decentralize. This requires us to stop gatekeeping people from having ownership over the work that they produce, over the land that they live in. And this also means looking at restorative justice, because what our generations are experiencing today is also generational. Domestic workers come from families that have generations of mothers and grandmothers and siblings, etc., in the domestic work sector. The same can be said of a lot of vulnerable populations, because this is almost an inherited status quo or socioeconomic status that we need to look into beyond the individual status of a family or the individual sort of context in which we live in, to look beyond that and make those collaborations meaningful across all of our generations.
I love, Rula, that you were like, I don't accept that we're not in it together, and that you've done a bad job and it's all on us. And that is important to say, that we are in this together, and you feel that as well. Valentina, last quick word on this.
Yes, I would like to make the call for us to promote the intergenerational dialogue too. I think it is important for you to make them own target, their own team, but I think it is important to stop talking about the elder, the younger, and start talking about how we can make it better together, because that's what sustainable means.
So I think, Jay, that means you're most welcome in the movement. You don't need to be 14 years old to be with us.
I must say that, part of it is building an intelligent cooperation and a dialogue. And across the African continent, elders like myself, Magrasa, Michelle, etc., are saying to young people, we are standing behind you. You may not agree with everything you do, but understand that we need change. And we have to move from being 54 fiefdoms that are divided by the world and exploited by the world, to developing an African agenda from the bottom up. And at the end of the day, that's where leadership is. Because looking up, we're going to be constantly disappointed. So we can hope, but we need to compel those that hold power to understand they rule through a mandate that we give them as the people. And that's what we bring about transparency and accountability back into politics.
I love that you use the word mandate there, and you'll note I'm saying I love a lot, which is a good indication of where this session is going. But I just heard the bit of breaking news that on that last question of how people think, whether people think they're likely to alter their actions based on what they've heard today, 76% of respondents said they are highly likely to alter their actions based on what they've experienced just today, day one of the SDG Action Zone. So that mandate is real, and I think we're feeling it right here. So we've just got a few minutes to go, and I want to just make one quick round around the horn one more time. So Ahala, I'm going to start with you. And this question from the audience speaks to something you mentioned a little bit before, but I'd love for you to go a tiny bit deeper. It is, what has been the resistance of corporations to change? Why is that the case?
Great question. I actually think it's the crisis of conformity. It's the old Einstein saying that Jay referred to, before. We keep doing the same, expecting different outcomes, and that time has to be over. But conformity is read by sameness. And when leadership and discussion rooms about anything look and feel the same, I sometimes say are male, pale, and stale, they're not gonna, sort of propel us to see and solve the very challenges that are facing the multiple stakeholders that are not around the table. So I'm a huge believer that we have to change who to change how, so we can deliver this shared prosperity on a healthy planet that we as humans all want. But I also think we need to unlock our humanity. And I just think we've been out of touch with it. And I almost think business schools don't teach us to be humans.
But I mean, if you haven't tweeted yet, business schools don't teach us to be humans should be in your Twitter feed straight away. And I was just about to say that this entire panel thus far has felt like a masterclass in communications, because I think something that holds us at bay from this conversation a lot of the time is that we're not always speaking the language that normal people going through their lives who aren't steeped in this are. And it's been wonderful to hear how concrete and how evocative you all are. With that, I'll go to Olivier now. A question for you from Christina in New York. Do developing countries need more or less help from the outside in order to grow in the face of the COVID-19 crisis? Mute, you're on mute.
Thank you. No, it's a very tough question. I think, of course, developing countries are in a very difficult position as a result of their levels of debt having increased significantly. And they were caught by surprise. Many of them have huge gaps in their social protection systems and were not able to react in order to protect their populations from the huge impacts of the economic and social crisis the world has been facing. On the other hand, it is not healthy to further deepen the dependence of these countries on external support. In my role as Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, I am advocating for a global fund for social protection that would allow those countries to be supported better, to establish social protection floors, to protect them better, to make them more resilient in the face of the next crisis that might emerge. But importantly, this global fund is a way to convince those countries, provide them an incentive to find their own solutions and to mobilize their domestic resources in order to support their populations. I think it's really important to ensure that social protection, social resilience are at the top of the political priorities of these countries, and that it is part of the social contract between the governments and the population in these countries, which means financing social protection by collecting local taxes, by formalizing informal workers, and by gradually dedicating more of the growth of the country to protecting workers. So it's not the North helping the South, it is the usual donors providing an incentive for those countries to take more action in order to protect themselves better from the next crisis. And I think it's important not to fall back into the old paradigm of North-South relationships that are deeply biased and imbalanced as a result of Northern countries having created this dependency on the resources they provide.
As a result of long history. Thank you so much for that, Rula. I want to go to a question for you from someone in the audience. What are the threats and challenges that domestic workers are facing at the moment, for example, related to the climate crisis?
In relation
and again,
to the time,
a little bit of a short answer if you can. We only have a few minutes to go.
Absolutely. So the environmental crisis that we're witnessing is destabilizing a lot of people from the rural areas where they used to be engaging in agriculture in order to contribute into the rapid urbanization, which feminizes labor, because as we know, women are the biggest reserve army for labor that is menial, and this is how they enter a lot of informal sectors such as domestic work. Another way that the climate crisis is influencing not only domestic workers but other informal workers as well is that it actually has created the channels through which the pandemic has spread. The pandemic has spread in factories and in places that are very crowded, where there was no protection, whether labor protection or health and safety measures put in place, because the lives of these people and these workers were considered disposable. And therefore, if we want to break the Anthropocene and not to contribute to the recreation of such an environment where such pandemic thrives, we need to look at workers' rights and to reform our labor laws as well.
Thank you so much, Rula. Now, 1 minute each for Valentina and Jay. Valentina, for you, what needs to be done to get more girls and young women into the fields of digital transformation and AI?
Well, as I said in my lightning talk, I feel like digital rights are the first step we are trying to put girls inside the cyberspace, but we have not girls with internet access. The girls, the women, are the less digital literate group in the world. So I think that we need to start with that, with giving girls internet access, a good internet access, because I'm with a internet access problem right now, and that's why
But we're
we
glad
need
to have you with us.
Yeah, that's the big reason why we need digital rights, because we can train girls on how they can make technology if they don't know the technology. We need to give the technology to the girls so they can start making it on their own and making innovation inside the world of technology.
Being native to it. And Jay, last but not least, a lovely question that may be a great place to end on, because it's one that looks to the future. What would you say to a 9-year-old girl who's a victim of racism and discrimination right now?
Stand up. And I have a 2-year-old grandson. He's my wisdom keeper, and he teaches me something new every day, particularly adventure and curiosity. So I'm discovering a whole world through his eyes, and it's fabulous. It's embracing life, and when I was 9 years old, I believed I was inferior to white people growing up under apartheid. I actually believed. I was angry with myself. I was angry with my parents. We were evicted from our house because we were the wrong color on the wrong side of the street. But, it was someone like a Steve Biko lit a spark in my heart. And that's what people are looking for, from us, is to light the spark. And once that spark is lit, then you find a direction to go in. And I think what we have to tackle is toxic masculinity and patriarchy. It's so deeply in our DNA, in the United Nations, in business, in government, in trade unions, in religion, in our family. So if you want that 9-year-old girl to grow up into a world where there is intelligent and radical cooperation between male and female, and I'm not talking about it as a biological thing, as a dimensional issue, and that we acknowledge that we have to heal, because that's what women bring. That's why women carry life. And if we crush women, we are going to crush the ability for us to heal our wounds and build a world that will not be hostile to our future generations.
And we need that world. We are out of time. I let it go to the last second because this has been incredible. You are all my wisdom keepers, and I aspire to be a wisdom keeper too. And everybody out there, I know you feel just the same. So thank you. Obviously, we could keep talking forever, but time has just flown by. So thank you all, speakers, participants, for making this first ever Ask Away such a memorable part of the SDG Action Zone. I am so glad this worked. And if you enjoyed it, there's another one tomorrow. So tune in and ask away. And with that, I'll see you in a second on the other side to officially close day 1 of the SDG Action Zone. Stay with us.